China is one of the oldest advanced civilizations on Earth. The size of the entire European continent, this multi-ethnic state is home to 1/5 of the world's population. For more than 2,000 years, this huge country was ruled by various imperial dynasties. Isolated from the common people, its emperors ruled China from the Forbidden City, an extensive palace complex in Beijing. Languishing in traditions and ritualized politics, the ruling caste failed to lead their country into the modern era. As with many other monarchies, around the turn of the 20th century in China too, the feudal system began to falter. The poor became more and more impoverished, while a clique of corrupt court officials filled their pockets. The colonial powers pushed their way into this backward country and brought the Chinese economy to a standstill. Soon, huge areas were suffering from grinding poverty. In the early 20th century, famine and epidemics spread like wildfire.
When I first got to China, and when I was working in the United Nations Famine Relief Program, the average life expectancy was 31, 32 years. 25% of all babies born died before the end of their first year. And there was constant famine every year, constant plague, bubonic plague, yellow fever, typhoid, typhus, cholera, everything you can think of, killed thousands of people every year. And there was banditry everywhere. The roads weren't safe. Your home wasn't safe. And unemployed, huge numbers of unemployed.
Mao Zedong was born in 1893 in the province of Hunan, in the hinterland of central China. His father was a wealthy farmer. The eldest of 3 sons, Mao lived with his family on a remote homestead. News of the emperor's death only reached this area 2 years later. His father made sure that Mao enjoyed a comprehensive school education. But the young man felt no desire to become a farmer.
He grew up in the countryside where he enjoyed a privileged position. He never knew hunger. His father wasn't a capitalist, but he was still a wealthy farmer. So the family never suffered. Mao had the privilege of an education, but it was what he wanted. In fact, he had to fight to overcome resistance from his parents. In the end, they removed all barriers to his education, and his father footed the bills. What Mao read politicized him. He was given books on steam engines, books on electricity, books on new things that made him wonder why his country didn't have them. Then, of course, as a student, he took part in all the discussions on colonialism, on independence, and on the founding of the First Republic.
Finally, in autumn 1911, the revolution came. The 5-year-old emperor, Pu Yi, was to be forced to abdicate. Mao joined the anti-imperialist forces. In January 1912, the Republic of China was founded. Pu Yi abdicated. But the young state was weak. Soon the huge empire sank into chaos once again. Mao went back to school, but he totally lacked orientation with regard to his future.
Mao had enjoyed training to become a teacher. Before starting his teaching seminar, he had withdrawn to a library for a few weeks and read absolutely everything he could get hold of. He also applied for a place at a wide range of colleges, from soap making to whatever, say economics. But he was never good at languages. At those universities, he would have had to speak English. But that was beyond him. So he continued his search, and when he found the teaching seminar in Changsha, it was just right for him. At the school, there were plenty of progressive teachers with Republican ideas.
Mao believed the newly founded republic was in danger. The tottering nation had come under the influence of a wide range of powers. Regional military commanders, like the colonial powers, tried to enrich themselves at the cost of this unstable country and exploited China. The new government was weak, corrupt, and full of cliques. Interim, emergency, and military governments ruled one after another. It was in this climate that young Mao discovered his talent for politics. He began to write his first articles. Our nation lacks strength. Military spirit has not been encouraged. The physical state of our people is deteriorating day by day. These are extremely worrying phenomena, Mao wrote in 1917.
Für ihn ist entscheidend die Fähigkeit, auch zu schreiben.
The ability to write and express himself incredibly well in Chinese was of major importance to him. For the first time, he felt a kind of power that made him superior to the others. So this ability to articulate, to get to the heart of things, revealed itself at an early stage.
Also diese Fähigkeit, sich zu artikulieren.
After completing his studies to become a teacher, he wrote his first periodicals, which were very moving and highly inflammatory. They showed that he definitely possessed charismatic qualities.
Die auch sehr bewegend waren, und da hatte sicher auch so charismatisch.
But Mao's politicization took place in Beijing when he worked there and began publishing his journals. That is when he focused on the real issues.
Da hat sich damit auseinandergesetzt.
In 1918, Mao went to Beijing to study. And it was here that he met intellectuals who focused on Marxism. For the first time, he also came into contact with the trailblazing political writings which were to vastly change the 20th century.
Mao selbst hat sich ja geweigert, ins Ausland zu
Mao
gehen.
refused to go abroad. Unlike many others, he never visited France or the Soviet Union.
Aber hat dann, als
But he had spent many years training to become a teacher in Beijing and had worked in a library. For the first time, he had read theoretical writings, but only on a rudimentary basis, of course. Virtually nothing, it must be said, had been translated into Chinese. The works of Marx and Engels were not translated until the 1950s. Before then, only sections had appeared in translation.
Vorher immer nur stückweise.
Educated circles in China followed developments in Russia with great interest. And China's massive neighbor was also having to deal with huge upheavals of its own. The Tsarist Empire had imploded. Its ruling dynasty had been ousted and replaced with a people's government. Through socialism to communism was the slogan Vladimir Ilyich Lenin gave the people. His declared aim was to bring about a world revolution. The Soviet state did not hesitate to export its new ideology. As early as 1920, the Russian Secret Service opened a branch in Shanghai. Based on the Soviet model, the Communist International planned to create a dictatorship of the proletariat in China too. In 1921, with generous financial and personal support from Soviet Russia, the Chinese Communist Party was established in Shanghai. Mao Zedong gave up his job as a teacher and became a professional revolutionary. He saw communism first and foremost as a vehicle for mobilizing the masses for the good of the state.
Sie haben einfach geguckt, okay, wo ist eine Chance?
They asked themselves where there was a chance for an underdeveloped country to develop a political system which meant participation. The first possibility was through communism, whereby the Soviet Union was not exactly the worst model. Originally, when the party was founded, China's communists had been an insignificantly small group. The party only gained appreciably in size over the course of its long conflict with the nationalists.
To pacify the country, initially the communists joined forces with Kuomintang, the National People's Party led by Chiang Kai-shek. But when the communists began to plan Soviet republics in China, the alliance collapsed and the two parties became enemies. In August 1927, civil war broke out in China. Chiang Kai-shek savagely put down several revolts by the communists. Fighting between the two sides took place with extreme violence and claimed countless victims, especially among the civilian population. Massacres occurred in several major cities. From 57 members when it was founded, membership of the Chinese Communist Party had by now grown to 58,000. Thousands of communists were arrested. The right-wing Kuomintang soon succeeded in destroying the Communist Party's power bases in the cities. Mao, who had gone underground, now had a fighting force of 5,000 men. His aim was to get the peasants on the side of the communists. The peasants were easily the most numerous section of the Chinese population. In the years that followed, in the hinterland of South China, Mao and his units managed to win over numerous peasants and miners to their cause. The current upswing of the peasant movement, Mao wrote in 1927, is a true sensation. In every province in China, hundreds of millions of peasants will rise up, as restless and fierce as a hurricane. And no power, no matter how great, will be strong enough to resist them. They will burst all their shackles and storm forth.
In this early phase, it already became relatively clear that in China the emphasis would be placed on the countryside, that the peasants would play a totally different role, simply because there was no industrial proletariat of any appreciable size. So the party wanted to spread the revolution by organizing peasants and peasant associations. There was also a clear difference regarding the role of the superstructure, the ideology, the mass line. It was decided that ideas from the people would also be taken up, that not everything would be predefined in elitist fashion, but that there would be give and take, alternation between top and bottom. So, in the final analysis, it sounded as if there was the possibility of criticism of the party from outside. It would have been unthinkable in most of the other communist systems for the people or for various groups to exercise criticism of excesses by the bureaucracy or something similar. Those are things you would never find in the Soviet Union.
Communism thus received its Chinese stamp. News of this arbitrary change of direction did not go down well in Moscow. The new Soviet General Secretary Joseph Stalin ruthlessly persecuted every conceivable rival within the party. Stalin sought to gain influence in China and had invested a great deal in the Chinese communists. He had hoped for a more obedient comrade than Mao Zedong appeared to be. But Mao asserted himself. He was steadily progressing towards the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party.
He'd already caught the attention of Moscow even in the early 1930s. The Soviets noticed the success he was having every so often in his strongholds. But Mao was only ever one player amongst several who were being built up simultaneously by Stalin and the Comintern. There were also trained cadres even in Moscow, who were also in view. In fact, there were lots of factors involved, like Mao's military and strategic achievements along with the errors of the previous party chairman. There was also his ability to adapt to this situation, to have no scruples with regard to power struggles within the party. In the final analysis, to use violence also within the party. And we also have his ability to portray himself as the party's theoretician. In the late 1930s, Mao wrote a series of theoretical articles which, on the one hand made him not only the movement's thinker, but on the other hand also a practical revolutionary leader. In this respect, he combined Stalin and Lenin in one person.
In 1931, south of the Yangtze River, Mao founded the first Chinese Soviet state. His comrades in arms saw his potential and bowed to his claim to leadership. One of his first military commanders, Zhou Enlai, remained faithful to Mao throughout his entire life.
Before coming to power, when he was struggling to get the peasants to support the revolution, to win power, he was the best listener that I ever heard. Marxism for him was only a tool, an instrument to drive the Chinese Revolution to success. He was not at all interested in political theory as theory. So he would make it up as he went along to meet what he perceived as the needs of Chinese reality. That was the thing about Mao that put him ahead of all the other Chinese leaders.
Mao's closest colleagues were Zhou Enlai and Zhu De. For 7 years, they fought a guerrilla war against the Chinese nationalist forces of the Kuomintang. Mao was now starting to make a name for himself internationally. Mao was first mentioned by the London Times newspaper in 1929 in a report from its Shanghai correspondent. The name Chu Mao has been notorious on the borders of Fujian and Guangdong for 2 years now. He has twice been driven into the mountains, but there he proved too mobile to be captured. But with the first signs of détente, he came back down and devastated the plain. Chu Mao calls himself a communist. Wherever he goes, he turns to the peasants and tells them they must destroy the capitalists and bourgeois elements. Yet he himself, the Times wrote in 1927, is the worst bandit of all. Writing later about the protracted war, Mao wrote, "The army must become one with the people so that the people feel that the army is their own. Such an army will be invincible." While the two opponents in the Civil War were involved in bitter fighting in South China, Japanese troops invaded Manchuria, and in 1931 proclaimed the puppet state of Manchukuo. Finally, in 1934, Mao's troops saw themselves encircled by the more powerful nationalist forces. Retreat was inevitable. So around 86,000 people headed west. The leadership group around Mao decided to make for Yanan, near the Soviet-controlled border region. The men who took part in this long march were a motley crew.
When you look at the leadership groups, you find a fair number of once privileged figures, wealthy farmers or at least landowners. But the troops they led were a wild assembly of former bandits, mercenaries and soldiers, but also idealistic young men and women, more and more of whom had joined the party from the towns and cities. Originally, though, the leadership had grabbed all the fighters it could.
The Long March became Mao's strategic masterpiece. In contrast to what propaganda has since claimed, it was primarily an escape towards the northwest. The retreat, through more than 10,000 kilometers of almost impassable terrain, took a whole year, during which time Mao finally succeeded in gaining acceptance as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party.
At this point, Mao Zedong did not play any kind of superior role. During the flight, however, the military errors committed by the commanders at the time forced Mao into a leading role. But the whole enterprise was a major disaster. It was a long flight movement. Of the 86,000 in the front, which also included Mao, losses were so high that only 8,000 survived. However, thanks to Mao himself, a legend was created, that a group of resolute fighters, mainly men, because only a handful of women took part in the Long March, would succeed in defying all resistance in order to build a new and glorious future for China.
Dass es denen also gelingt, all diesen Widerständen zu trotzen, eine neue, glorreiche Zukunft Chinas aufzubauen.
The communists set up their headquarters in the remote upland plain in Yanan. Despite the enormous losses they had suffered, it was here that Mao Zedong became the role model for an entire generation.
Eine Sache war, dass den Leuten Ziele geben konnte.
One of his attributes was that he could give people goals, and he was a master at getting to the heart of an issue.
Und da war ein Meister.
That's what we are fighting for. That is our goal.
Zu sagen, dafür kämpfen wir.
Even redefining the Long March as a victory shows great skill.
Einen Sieg zu definieren, ist eine große Kunst.
Time and again in Yanan, Mao received national and international photographers and journalists and presented himself as a showcase communist.
Es gab in Yanan die ersten Anzeichen eines Personenkultes. Das wurde von mehreren...
In Yanan, the first signs of a personality cult became evident. It was promoted by others, but Mao also played along.
Weil sehr gut Chinesisch konnte in dem Sinn, dass
He was
mir
ideal
auf
for the
den
role.
Punkt brachte.
First of all, he spoke excellent Chinese. He could get straight to the heart of an issue.
Das Charisma hatte und das in seiner Person, gerade in Yanan, also
He also had this charisma, especially in Yanan, where he taught and led. Perhaps it had to do with his origins, or perhaps the fact that he had never been abroad, that he still symbolized both the Chinese peasant and the intellectual.
den chinesischen Bauern sowohl als auch den Intellektuellen.
He embodied everything. He was just right for the role.
Und dafür taugte er.
Mao worked hard at his image by specifically inviting various Western journalists to portray him. Young American Sidney Rittenberg, who came to China in 1944, was fascinated by Mao's aura.
He had an aura. He attracted people because of the aura of being the leader. But the main attraction was the power of his mind, his ability to analyze and to formulate. He could formulate very complex political issues in very simple, popular language.
Mao succeeded in winning over the rural population with cautious reforms. For the first time, portraits of Mao were soon to be seen on the walls of houses in the villages and on public buildings. Schools were named after him. Yanan became a place of pilgrimage. The base in the barren upland valley grew constantly. Amongst other things, the comrades managed to survive economically because of their extensive opium poppy fields, which guaranteed around 40% of their income. Very few of the party members knew anything about communism. 2/3 were illiterate. Mao's educational concept bound them to him and the party politically and socially. Later, the time in Yanan was glorified as the communist model era.
Es schien, und es war wahrscheinlich anfangs auch in Teilen, ein anderer Lebensentwurf.
It seemed like a different life. And in certain ways, at first it was different from what was possible in the towns where the Kuomintang held sway. A modern democratic China really seemed to be emerging as a microcosm. And that was attractive. This suddenly gave many the chance to express themselves, perhaps to restore a certain form of literature, to live this equality between men and women. That made it attractive. The fact that people also began informing on one another and that restrictive political issues were suddenly introduced is another story. They said that could be freedom, that could be a new China. But as propaganda, it certainly achieved something.
Das könnte ein neues China werden. Insofern hat es als Propaganda durchaus was bewirkt.
In this communist enclave, many experienced democratic participation for the first time. Even the more educated on the Long March received ideological education and were urged to do physical work. At the same time, however, Mao also initiated the first purges in the party to free it from spies and bad elements. Those who confessed, sometimes under torture, were given the chance to improve. Mao also had critical remarks and writings persecuted. Yet his appeal remained undiminished. Young idealists flocked to Yanan from all over the country. People like Jiang Qing, a 23-year-old actress from Shanghai.
Sie ging als überzeugte Kommunistin nach Yanan. Wenn man die alten Fotos sieht, sie war.
She went to Yanan as a convinced communist. These are old photos, but you can see how attractive she was. She was an actress whose moral conduct was, for the first time, very loose. The party leadership was not at all happy to see Mao in a relationship with this woman. But he followed a straight line. It could really have harmed him in those days. But all he said was, "I'm going to do it. I'm going to marry her." They had a daughter together. He put his head way above the parapet. But politically, she backed him to the hilt. She was a highly emancipated and very resolute woman.
Politisch bedingungslos zu ihm gestanden. Aber sie war auch eine sehr emanzipierte, sehr konsequente Frau.
In 1939, Mao married Jiang Jing, who, in return, had to promise not to engage in politics in public. Mao's fourth wife was not daunted by rumors of his constant womanizing.
I know that some of the reports on his womanizing were grossly exaggerated, but apparently he always had a mistress, at least one. But the only woman I ever saw him with, except at dances, was Jiang Qing, his wife. You know, I never saw any real warmth between the two of them, but he was an aloof person. Like with Zhou Enlai and his wife, or Zhu De and his wife, they were very warm. But Mao, I never saw Mao very warm towards anybody.
Jiang Qing remained devoted to Mao for the rest of her life. Just like Zhou Enlai and Zhu De, with whom Mao worked on his war strategy against the Kuomintang.